By September 1944, it seemed as if the war in Europe was already decided. Just 3 months earlier, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy, broken through German lines, and surged across France with astonishing speed. Paris was liberated, German armies were retreating, and many commanders believed the end of the war might come before Christmas. Confidence was high, perhaps too high. Supply lines were stretched thin, fuel shortages slowed armored divisions, and yet the pressure to keep advancing never eased. The prevailing belief was simple: keep pushing and Germany would collapse. But on the western edge of Germany itself, a dark and largely ignored obstacle stood in the path of that advance. The Hürtgen Forest did not look like a decisive battlefield on any map. It was a dense, rugged woodland stretching across the border, filled with steep ridges, narrow trails, and thick pine trees that blocked visibility in every direction. To some planners, it seemed like a minor nuisance, something that could be cleared quickly while the main thrust of the Allied advance pushed deeper into the German heartland. But the forest concealed far more than trees. It concealed preparation, intention, and a defense built over years. The strategic reasoning behind entering the forest appeared sound on paper. Allied commanders feared that German forces hidden within the Hürtgen could threaten the flank of the main advance toward the Rhine River. Even more importantly, several key dams lay just beyond the forest. If the Germans opened those dams, they could flood the Rohr River Valley, halting any Allied crossing and delaying the invasion of Germany itself. Securing the forest, therefore, was seen as a necessary step to protect the broader offensive. It was not meant to become a prolonged battle. It was supposed to be a precaution. Yet, from the very beginning, there were warning signs that something was being overlooked. Aerial reconnaissance provided only limited insight due to the thick canopy. Intelligence on German positions was incomplete. The terrain itself was poorly understood by many of the officers planning the advance. Maps did not capture the full brutality of the landscape: deep ravines, muddy paths, and an environment that turned mechanized warfare into a slow and grinding struggle. Still, the decision was made. American infantry would enter the forest and clear it. Waiting for them inside were German forces who had every advantage the Americans lacked. They knew the terrain intimately. They had fortified positions carefully hidden among the trees. Artillery was pre-registered, meaning they could fire with deadly accuracy at any advancing unit. Defensive lines were layered, designed not for rapid victory, but for attrition. The forest itself became a weapon. Shells detonated in the treetops, sending shards of wood and metal raining down with devastating effect. It was a type of warfare that many American soldiers had never experienced before. When the first units stepped into the Hürtgen Forest, they did so with expectations shaped by recent success. They had seen German forces retreat. They had witnessed breakthroughs and rapid advances. What they encountered instead was something entirely different. Movement was slow, often reduced to a crawl. Tanks and vehicles struggled to navigate the narrow, muddy paths. Communication broke down as radio signals were disrupted by the dense forest. Units became isolated, sometimes losing contact with neighboring companies just a few hundred yards away. Almost immediately, the cost began to mount. German artillery found its targets with frightening precision. Mortar fire echoed through the trees, impossible to locate until it was too late. Snipers operated unseen. Mines littered the forest floor. Every step forward carried risk. The forest absorbed sound, distorted distance, and created a constant sense of disorientation. Soldiers could not see the enemy clearly, but they could feel the danger pressing in from all sides. Weather soon compounded the problem. Autumn rains turned the ground into thick mud, trapping vehicles and exhausting infantry. As temperatures dropped, cold and damp conditions took their toll. Soldiers spent long hours in foxholes filled with water, unable to dry their clothes or rest properly. Fatigue set in quickly, and with it came a creeping realization that this was not going to be a short operation. The forest was not something that could be easily cleared. It was something that had to be endured. Despite these conditions, orders remained unchanged. The forest had to be taken. Commanders, still focused on the larger strategic picture, continued to push units forward. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes at the cost of dozens of lives. Positions would be captured, only to be lost again under counterattack or artillery fire. The idea of a quick advance disappeared, replaced by a grinding battle of attrition that few had anticipated. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience was unlike anything they had faced before. There were no clear front lines, no dramatic breakthroughs, no visible victories, just endless trees, constant danger, and the growing weight of casualties. The forest seemed to swallow entire units, leaving behind only fragments. And yet, they kept moving forward, because that was the order. What began as a calculated decision to secure a flank and protect a future advance was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The Hürtgen Forest was turning into a battlefield defined not just by strategy alone, but by endurance, confusion, and relentless loss. And as more American troops were sent into its depths, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a campaign that would challenge every assumption made in those confident days after Normandy. What the American soldiers discovered inside the Hürtgen Forest was not just an enemy, but an environment that seemed designed to destroy them. The deeper they moved into the woods, the more the battlefield itself began to dictate the terms of the fight. Visibility shrank to a few dozen meters in any direction. The towering pine trees blocked sunlight, muffled sound, and turned even the simplest movements into calculated risks. There were no clear lines, no open fields, no sense of where the enemy began or ended. Every step forward felt like walking into the unknown. The Germans understood this terrain perfectly, and they used it with ruthless efficiency. Their defenses were not always visible, but they were always present. Machine gun nests were hidden behind natural cover, camouflaged so well that soldiers could pass within meters without noticing them, until they opened fire. Mortar teams operated from concealed positions, adjusting their aim with deadly precision. And above all, there was the artillery. It was the most feared weapon in the forest, not just because of its power, but because of how it interacted with the environment. When artillery shells exploded in open terrain, their fragments spread outward, but in the Hürtgen Forest, they detonated in the treetops. The shells would strike branches and explode above the ground, sending thousands of razor-sharp wooden splinters and metal fragments raining down. Soldiers called them tree bursts, and they were devastating. There was no real cover. Foxholes offered little protection from the deadly rain falling from above. Even when a unit dug in, it was never truly safe. The forest itself became a weapon, amplifying every explosion into something far more lethal. Movement was slow and exhausting. The ground was uneven, filled with roots, rocks, and hidden depressions. Paths quickly turned into mud under constant rain and troop movement. Vehicles struggled almost immediately. Tanks, which had been so effective in the open fields of France, found themselves confined to narrow trails where they became easy targets. Supply trucks bogged down or were forced to turn back. This left infantry units increasingly isolated, often short on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Communication began to break down as well. Radios, already unreliable in dense terrain, often failed entirely. Units lost contact with each other, and coordination became nearly impossible. Orders were delayed or never arrived. Reinforcements struggled to find their way through the maze-like forest.
In some cases, entire companies fought for hours without knowing what was happening just a few hundred meters away. Confusion became a constant companion, adding to the stress and uncertainty of every operation. Then came the weather. Autumn in the Hürtgen Forest was unforgiving. Rain fell steadily, soaking uniforms and turning the ground into thick, clinging mud. As the weeks passed, temperatures dropped. Cold crept into everything, into weapons, into clothing, into the bodies of the soldiers themselves. Nights were especially brutal. Men huddled in foxholes filled with water, shivering, unable to light fires without revealing their position. Sleep was rare and never restful. Exhaustion built day by day, slowly eroding both physical strength and morale. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike other battles where the enemy could be seen, engaged, and defeated, the Hürtgen offered no such clarity. The enemy was often invisible. The danger was constant. Every sound, a snapping branch, a distant thud, could signal an incoming attack. Soldiers lived in a state of permanent tension, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Some described it as fighting a ghost, an unseen force that could strike at any moment without warning. Casualties mounted quickly, and not just from enemy fire. Trench foot, exposure, and sheer exhaustion began to claim their own victims. Medical evacuation was difficult, sometimes impossible. Wounded soldiers often had to wait hours, even days, before they could be carried out of the forest. For many, survival depended not just on avoiding bullets, but on enduring the environment itself. And yet, despite all of this, the orders did not change. Units were told to keep advancing, to take ground, to push deeper into the forest. Progress was painfully slow, measured in yards rather than miles. A single ridge or clearing could cost dozens of lives. Gains were often temporary, lost again under German counterattacks or relentless artillery fire. It became a cycle: advance, take losses, regroup, and advance again. For many veterans, the experience felt less like the fast-moving war they had expected and more like something from an earlier era. The conditions, the mud, the constant shelling, the sense of being trapped in a deadly landscape, it all echoed the worst memories of World War I. But this was 1944, and the belief had been that warfare had moved beyond such brutal stalemates. In the Hürtgen Forest, that belief was shattered. As the battle dragged on, it became clear that this was no longer a simple operation to secure a flank. The forest had turned into a grinding, relentless struggle where terrain and weather were just as deadly as the enemy. And with each passing day, the cost continued to rise, drawing more and more American soldiers into a fight that seemed to have no clear end.
By the time fresh American units were committed to the Hürtgen Forest, the pattern had already been set, even if few fully understood it yet. Divisions were sent in with clear objectives: capture a ridge, take a village, push the line forward, and almost immediately they were swallowed by the same conditions that had broken those before them. Progress was slow, casualties were high, and whatever ground was gained rarely brought any real strategic advantage. Still, the orders continued. The forest had to be cleared. The 4th Infantry Division was among the first to experience the full weight of the battle. What began as a determined advance quickly turned into a fight for survival. Companies moved forward through dense woods, only to be pinned down by unseen machine gun fire or shattered by artillery. Every attempt to maneuver was met with resistance. German defenses were not always strong in numbers, but they were positioned with precision. They knew exactly where the Americans would have to move, and they made those routes deadly. When the 28th Infantry Division entered the forest, the situation did not improve, it worsened.
Already exhausted from previous fighting, the division was tasked with pushing deeper into some of the most heavily defended areas. What followed was one of the most devastating periods of the entire campaign. Units were committed piece by piece, often without full coordination, and were hit almost immediately by concentrated fire. Losses mounted at a shocking rate. Entire companies were reduced to fractions of their original strength within days. The fighting for small objectives, hilltops, crossroads, patches of forest, became brutal and repetitive. A position would be attacked, taken at great cost, and then subjected to relentless German counterfire. Holding it proved just as deadly as capturing it. In many cases, the ground itself offered little value. There were no major breakthroughs, no decisive victories, just a continuous exchange of lives for territory that often had to be abandoned later. Tactical planning struggled to keep pace with reality. Commanders, operating with limited information, continued to order frontal assaults into terrain that favored the defender at every level. Artillery support, while powerful, was difficult to use effectively without clear visibility. Air support was often grounded due to weather, were rendered ineffective by the dense tree cover. The advantages that had defined earlier successes in France, mobility, coordination, overwhelming firepower, were largely neutralized inside the forest. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, known for its elite training and previous successes, was also drawn into the fight. They were assigned some of the most difficult objectives, including assaults on fortified positions deep within the forest. Even for experienced troops, the conditions were overwhelming. Close quarters combat became the norm, with engagements happening at extremely short distances. The Rangers fought with determination, but they were not immune to the same forces that were grinding down every unit committed to the battle. As the weeks went on, a grim pattern emerged. Units would enter the forest at full strength, confident and prepared. Within a short time, they would suffer heavy casualties, become disorganized, and be pulled back or replaced. Then another unit would take their place, repeating the same process. It was a cycle of attrition that showed little sign of ending. Reinforcements filled the gaps, but they too were quickly absorbed into the same relentless struggle. The psychological impact deepened with each passing day. Soldiers began to realize that survival often depended on luck as much as skill. There were no safe areas, no predictable patterns. Artillery could strike at any moment. A hidden machine gun could open fire without warning. Even the act of moving from one position to another carried constant risk. The sense of control that soldiers relied on in other battles was almost entirely absent here. Communication issues only added to the chaos. Frequently, units lost contact with higher command, making coordinated operations nearly impossible. Orders, when they did arrive, were sometimes based on outdated or incomplete information. This led to repeated assaults on positions that were stronger than expected or already lost. Confusion on the battlefield translated directly into higher casualties, as men were sent forward into situations they could not fully understand. Despite all of this, the broader strategic goals remained unchanged. The forest was still seen as a necessary objective, a problem that had to be solved before the advance into Germany could continue. But on the ground, that objective felt increasingly distant. Soldiers were not thinking about rivers or dams or the larger war. They were thinking about the next step, the next tree, the next moment of survival. What made the situation even more difficult was the lack of visible progress. In other battles, even costly ones, there was often a sense that something was being achieved, that each sacrifice brought the war closer to its end. In the Hürtgen Forest, that sense was missing. Gains were measured in yards, and even those gains were uncertain. It was a battle defined not by movement, but by stagnation. As casualties continued to rise, questions began to emerge, even if they were not always voiced openly. Was the objective worth the cost? Were the tactics appropriate for the conditions? Could the forest be bypassed rather than fought through? These questions lingered in the background, but they did not change the immediate reality. The fighting continued, and more men were sent into the forest. By the end of this phase of the battle, one thing had become unmistakably clear. The Hürtgen Forest was not just another obstacle on the path to Germany. It had become a grinding battlefield in its own right, consuming divisions, eroding morale, and challenging the very assumptions that had guided the Allied advance since Normandy. And still, the line had barely moved.
For the men fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, the battle was no longer defined by maps or objectives, but by moments, brief, intense, and often terrifying moments that determined whether they would survive the next hour. The larger strategy faded into the background. What remained were the sounds, the cold, and the constant awareness that death could come without warning. Every soldier carried his own version of the forest, shaped by what he had seen and endured. Some of those experiences were later captured by men who had the ability to put them into words. Among them was Ernest Hemingway, who entered the Hürtgen as a war correspondent. Even for someone who had witnessed conflict before, the conditions inside the forest stood out as something uniquely destructive. He described it in terms that echoed one of the most infamous battles of the First World War, comparing it to Passchendaele, but with explosions ripping through trees instead of open mud fields. His observations were not dramatic exaggerations. They reflected the reality that soldiers faced every day. Another young man moving through that same forest was J.D. Salinger. At the time, he was not yet known for his writing, but the experiences he carried with him would leave a lasting mark. Like thousands of others, he endured the exhaustion, the confusion, and the ever-present danger. The forest did not distinguish between famous names and ordinary soldiers. Everyone was subject to the same conditions, the same fear, and the same uncertainty. First-hand accounts from soldiers reveal a pattern that official reports could never fully capture. Men spoke of moving through the trees in near silence, afraid to make even the smallest sound. They described the sudden violence of artillery strikes, where a quiet moment could instantly turn into chaos. 1 second there would be nothing but the sound of wind through branches, and the next the air would be filled with explosions, splintering wood and shrapnel. There was no time to prepare, no warning that could be trusted. Wounded soldiers often lay where they fell, not because they were forgotten, but because reaching them was too dangerous. Medics risked their lives to crawl through mud and debris, trying to provide aid under fire. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. The forest made every rescue attempt a gamble. Stretchers had to be carried over uneven ground, through narrow paths, often under constant threat of incoming shells. Evacuation could take hours, and in many cases that time was the difference between life and death. Despite the overwhelming conditions, acts of courage continued to emerge. Small groups of soldiers held their positions against repeated attacks. Individuals exposed themselves to enemy fire to pull wounded comrades to safety. Others pressed forward through machine gun fire to complete missions that seemed impossible. These moments did not change the overall course of the battle, but they defined the character of those who fought it. 6 soldiers would eventually receive the Medal of Honor for their actions in the Hürtgen Forest. Each story carried its own weight, its own example of bravery under conditions that pushed human limits. These were not abstract acts of heroism. They happened in the mud, in the cold, in the middle of chaos, where decisions had to be made in seconds. The recognition came later, but the actions themselves were immediate, instinctive responses to a battlefield that offered no mercy. The psychological strain was just as intense as the physical danger.
Soldiers described a constant state of tension, where sleep was shallow and often interrupted by the sounds of combat. Even in moments of relative quiet, there was no real sense of safety. The forest seemed alive with threat. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every noise could signal incoming fire. Over time, this pressure wore men down, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Letters sent home, when they could be written, often avoided the full truth. Soldiers spoke of difficult conditions, but many left out the details that would be impossible to explain. How do you describe a place where the ground itself feels hostile, where the sky above you can suddenly explode, where the line between survival and death is measured in seconds? For those who lived through it, the experience stayed with them long after the battle ended. What makes these accounts so powerful is not just what they describe, but what they reveal about the nature of the battle itself. The Hürtgen Forest was not a place of sweeping movements or clear victories. It was a place of endurance, where the outcome was shaped by countless small actions taken under extreme pressure. It was a test not just of strategy, but of human resilience. For every official report, there were hundreds of untold stories. Stories of fear, of determination, of loss, and of survival. Together, they form a picture of a battlefield that cannot be understood through numbers alone. It has to be seen through the eyes of those who were there, moving step by step through the darkness, never knowing what waited ahead. And as the battle continued, these voices, whether recorded by famous writers or carried silently by ordinary soldiers, became the only way to truly understand what the Hürtgen Forest had become. Not just a military operation, but a deeply human experience, defined by struggle, sacrifice, and the will to endure.
By early 1945, the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest had finally begun to fade, but not because of a decisive breakthrough or a clear victory. Instead, the battle simply lost its place in the larger momentum of the war. The front lines shifted, new offensives took priority, and attention moved toward the final push into Germany. What remained behind in the forest was not a triumph, but a cost, one that was difficult to measure and even harder to justify. When the campaign ended, the numbers told only part of the story. Tens of thousands of American soldiers had been killed, wounded, or taken out of action due to exhaustion and exposure. Entire divisions had been rotated through the forest, each one leaving with fewer men than it had brought in. The ground they fought over, dense woods, ridges, and shattered terrain, had changed hands multiple times, often without altering the broader strategic situation in any meaningful way. One of the original reasons for entering the forest was the concern over German control of the dams along the Roer River. In the end, those dams were not secured through the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen itself, but as part of later operations when German forces were already weakening. The forest, which had consumed so many lives, did not deliver the decisive advantage it was supposed to provide. This raised a difficult question that lingered long after the battle was over. Was the cost worth it? From a strategic perspective, some commanders argued that the operation had tied down German forces and prevented them from interfering with other Allied advances. But for the soldiers who had fought there, and for many historians who would later study the campaign, that explanation felt incomplete. The scale of the losses, combined with the limited gains, suggested that the battle had been shaped as much by flawed assumptions as by necessity. In the months that followed, the war moved quickly toward its conclusion. The Allied armies crossed the Rhine, advanced deep into Germany, and eventually forced the surrender of the German military. These final victories were large, visible, and decisive. They became the defining images of the end of the war in Europe. In comparison, the Hürtgen Forest faded into the background, overshadowed by operations that offered clearer outcomes and more recognizable success. Part of the reason for this silence lies in the nature of the battle itself. It did not fit the narrative of rapid progress and overwhelming victory that many associated with the later stages of the war. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no iconic moments that could easily be captured or retold. Instead, there was a slow, grinding struggle that produced heavy losses without a clear turning point. It was a story that was difficult to simplify, and perhaps even harder to confront. Unlike other major battles, the Hürtgen Forest was never widely portrayed in film or popular media. While other campaigns became the subject of books, documentaries, and movies, this one remained largely in the shadows. The reasons are complex. Partly it was because the battle lacked a clear narrative arc. Partly it was because the outcome did not offer the kind of resolution that audiences expect. But it may also be because the reality of the Hürtgen Forest challenges the idea that every operation in a war leads directly to victory. For those who survived, the memory of the forest did not fade so easily. Veterans carried it with them, often speaking of it as one of the most difficult experiences of their lives, not because it was the largest battle or the most famous, but because of the conditions they endured and the losses they witnessed. The forest left a mark that went beyond physical wounds. It shaped how they understood the war and, in many cases, how they remembered it. In the years after the war, historians began to look more closely at the campaign, trying to understand what had happened and why. They examined the decisions that led American forces into the forest, the tactics that were used, and the consequences that followed. Their conclusions were not always the same, but many agreed on one point. The Hürtgen Forest stands as a powerful example of how terrain, weather, and underestimation can turn even a well-equipped army into a force struggling just to survive. Today, the forest still stands, quieter than it was in 1944, but not unchanged. Beneath its trees lie the remnants of a battle that never fully entered public memory. It serves as a reminder that not all chapters of history are widely known, even when they carry immense significance. Some are overshadowed, not because they lack importance, but because they do not fit easily into the stories we choose to tell. And that may be the final truth of the Hürtgen Forest. It was not a battle that brought glory or clear victory. It was a battle that revealed the limits of planning, the cost of misjudgment, and the resilience of the soldiers who endured it. A campaign that asked for everything, gave very little in return, and then slowly disappeared from the spotlight, leaving behind only questions and the weight of what it took.